I am absolutely convinced that we're going to see more changes in the next 10 to 15 years in our world, in our lives, um, than we have seen in hundreds, perhaps even thousands of years. Well, we're seeing increased utilization of Internet of Things, or IoT, as it's sometimes called in shorthand, technology. The earliest emergence of this type of technology dates back decades to when we first began to see barcodes or QR codes used at retail locations for scanning products that were being sold, but also being used for helping them to manage their inventories. And increasingly, we have seen that Internet of Things technology consists of sensors that can detect where they are. They can detect external information like temperature, and in some cases, things like humidity, for instance. They have access to some form of energy. They either have a built-in battery or have access to energy of some kind. And they have built-in communications capabilities that allow them at the very least to do short-range communications, which could be, just a few feet or a few meters, or in some cases that can allow them to do longer range communications, like communicate via wireless cellular systems of various types. And over the decades since these technologies emerged, they've become smaller and easier to attach to physical items, or often in many cases are designed, built right into the items at the times that they're manufactured. So now in effect, we've made physical objects smart in the sense that they're able to communicate with the outside world, and at least communicate basic information with the outside world. So, for instance, one of the applications of Internet of Things technologies that's been evolving over the last 10 to even 15 years has been in shipping. For example, if you're shipping food or pharmaceuticals of various types, it's important that they be maintained at a certain temperature and within a very few number of degrees at that temperature during the entire transportation process. Well, one of the problems that has happened sometimes, and it's less frequent now, in part because we have this kind of technology incorporated, but as you might imagine, here in the United States at least, if truckers are carrying meat across the country, and that meat needs to be stored at exactly 37 degrees Fahrenheit, or say 3 degrees Celsius, then that means that trucker needs to be continuously operating their air conditioning systems to make sure that temperature is maintained. Well, operating those systems requires additional fuel and expense. And if the trucker is unscrupulous, they might just say, well, I'm going to be driving this cross country for 2 days. And if I turn it off as soon as I pick up the product and leave, and let the product warm up to whatever temperature it warms up to, even though it shouldn't, and I drive for 2 days, and then 4 or 5 hours before I get there, I finally turn the air conditioning system back on so that when I arrive, the product has been chilled back down. I've just saved myself maybe $50 or $75 worth of fuel, not having to run this air conditioning system in my truck. So I've made a more profitable, generated more money from this particular transportation service that I've delivered. And the suckers that are shipping this product, when it arrives, it seems like it's at cold, it's at the right temperature. And so consequently, people don't know that. Yeah, but for a day and a half, it was at 90 degrees, not 37 degrees, or let's say 35 Celsius, not 3 degrees Celsius. And as a result, it's going to spoil very rapidly once we get it into our shop, and it's not up to the standards we're expecting. And so with this kind of technology in place, you can have sensors that are embedded in, say, the packaging of the meat in this particular case, that are continuously monitoring the temperatures and are communicating that information through to external, via cellular systems and so forth, so that you can see a report every 15 minutes of what the temperature of that was. And if it wasn't kept at the appropriate temperature the entire time, you'll know about it and not accept the delivery. And eventually that sort of thing is going to catch up with the unscrupulous driver who's doing that. Well, that's just one example. And there's hundreds of other examples of ways that keeping track of the locations, temperatures, conditions of various different items. For example, the manufacturing conference I spoke at a few weeks ago, I met a guy who's developed software using Internet of Things technology to help people working on manufacturing floors. So it can keep track of where they are, where they're moving about, and it'll even notice, for example, it has, I don't recall the exact term, but if that person starts or stops very quickly, it'll notice that. So if you stumble, even if you don't fall down and get injured and report it, it might notice, well, that person tripped and lost their balance for a moment before they recovered it because the item was shaken in effect. I think it's called an accelerometer. And the result of that might be that, oh, well, the person tripped over a cable that's laid across the floor at that point. And if this has happened to various people on numerous occasions over the last few days or weeks since that cable was put in place, that can trigger a warning, even though so far nobody's fallen and injured themselves and had to report to the Human Resources Department that there's been this problem. It can draw that kind of a problem to the attention of management and say, oh, this is an issue we better fix. We either need to reroute that cable or we need to put something over top of it so people won't catch their foot on it. And it's going to make our manufacturing floor workers safer. And it's going to save money for us because we're not going to worry about having to pay for injuries that have been suffered by our people because we overlooked the potential hazard on our manufacturing floor. So those are just examples. And when you then, part of the challenge is when you have Internet of Things technologies. Here's another good example. Part of the state of California, as you're probably aware, has a problem almost every summer with wildfires. And with climate change, that problem has only been increasing in recent years. And they had, one of the things they did was put up, in effect, sensors that are television cameras that monitor wide areas of the forest to see if there is smoke or flame that indicates that there's a fire. The problem is they need hundreds of these cameras and sensors, and they can't hire enough people to continuously monitor each of those. So how can you continuously monitor hundreds of television cameras? Or in a broader sense, how can you continuously monitor hundreds or thousands of Internet of Things sensors when you can't possibly have enough people to track all of that data continuously and to be able to respond and act to it on it? You would have to have some kind of technology that not only could take in that information, but could act in an intelligent way in responding to that information when there's important changes that are taking place. And of course, artificial intelligence is exactly that. And that's why artificial intelligence integrated in this case with Internet of Things technologies can multiply the benefits of leveraging either of these emerging technologies on their own. The notion that we might be able to have a valid currency that could be exchanged um, digitally has been around for at least 35 years, that people have been trying to work on how to do this. As soon as the internet began to emerge and people began to recognize that there was commercial potential, people were saying, well, wouldn't it be great if there was some way we could make a payment over the internet that didn't require us to go through a third party provider? Whether we're talking about a bank, or whether we're talking about a service provider like Venmo, or we're talking about a credit card processing company like MasterCard or Visa or some of the other alternative processors. All of these third-party organizations add cost to the exchange and transfer of money in one way or another. Wouldn't it be great if I could just send you money digitally and you would somehow magically have that money and I could send it directly to you? And the problem that we had prior to the incorporation of blockchain technology to leverage cryptocurrencies, the first one of which was Bitcoin, and that goes back 16 years now. The seminal paper was written at the end of October in 2008, describing how blockchain technology could enable the could enable cryptocurrency, and they named the cryptocurrency Bitcoin. They didn't actually use the phrase blockchain in the underlying in the initial paper that described it, but very quickly the technology and the way it worked was described as blockchain, and the name has stuck. And the reason why blockchain works, and we're not going to get into the technical details of how blockchain works because it gets into some sophisticated mathematics, and unless you have the responsibility of being the technical person or part of a technical team that's implementing blockchain, you really don't need to understand the details of exactly how it works. But what it does is it validates that we are both looking at the same information. So if I send you 100 pounds, then it is now telling me we are both looking at the same data, and we are now seeing that this 100 pounds that used to belong to Jack now belongs to Megan. And everybody knows that that's the case. And we don't have to worry about a situation where I say I sent you the 100 pounds and you say you never received it. And then we have to worry about, well, all right, so who's telling the truth here? So you basically have what's called a single shared version of the truth. And that's what blockchain enables. And by enabling that and enabling cryptocurrency, it means money can be moved far more quickly and cost effectively. And the combination of those things is very important, because prior to the emergence of cryptocurrencies, and this is still the case for a lot of organizations and banks and financial institutions and so forth that haven't yet implemented cryptocurrency, is that if you wanted to move, say, €1 million from a payer in, or even say from a bank in one country to a bank in another country, for example, well, you would have to go through some third-party organization like SWIFT or through your various national banking organizations, make a series of accounting entries. Typically, what would happen is it would take anywhere from hours to a day or more to make the transfer, and there would be a cost of several euros that was imposed mostly by the third-party organizations that are affecting these changes. Whereas with cryptocurrency, if you're utilizing a shared cryptocurrency system, you can make that transfer of funds essentially instantly. Now, it's not going to be instant, but certainly within minutes, if not seconds. And the cost becomes very, very small. I mean, a tiny fraction of a euro, for example, because there does typically need to be some cost to helping offset the underlying cost of the systems. But what's happening is you're not paying large third-party financial organizations a significant profit margin. So what we're going to see happening over, I think, a relatively extended period of time is that cryptocurrencies are going to continue to act as, and increasingly act as a lubricant for financial systems and make it easier and less expensive to move money around. And that's a good thing. One of the problems that we have had with cryptocurrencies now over the last 10 years or so is that people have looked at this value and said, well, if using cryptocurrencies can add value to global financial systems, then sort of implicitly that means that those cryptocurrencies have a value themselves because they're being used to replace something else that costs us money at a much lower cost. And there's some value to that. And so presumably then there would be value to me in holding cryptocurrencies with the understanding that perhaps over time, as they're more widely used, the value of those cryptocurrencies will increase. And the mathematics that underlie Bitcoin, for example, dictate that there will only ever be a certain number, maximum number of Bitcoins that are created. It will take literally over 100 years to get to that point, but fewer and fewer Bitcoins are being created each year. And eventually there is a limit, and I believe the number is 21 million Bitcoins are all that there will ever be. So if there's an increased value to the financial systems of using Bitcoin, and Bitcoin reflects in part some of that increase in value, then there's going to be a certain amount of value, but a limited number of Bitcoins. And so therefore those individual Bitcoins might increase in value. So people speculate on the potential value of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. As those speculations go up and down, it's an investment with some potential long-term value, but in the short term, it's a very volatile, cryptocurrencies are a very volatile investment. They're also ones that people who understand how these systems work well, and again, are unscrupulous, can use it to defraud people who think that there's a great opportunity for them to profit by investing in cryptocurrencies, but don't understand the systems and the economics well enough to do so more effectively. And so there's been a lot of negative press about cryptocurrencies that, you know, this is all just a giant scam and there's not really any value because it's just ones and zeros. In fact, there is certainly value to cryptocurrencies. But I advise that people think about cryptocurrencies in terms of how can they be used as a tool to facilitate financial transactions of various types. And if you want to take your chances on investing in cryptocurrencies, just as you might want to invest in penny stocks or speculative forms of real estate or something like that, you know, have at it. That's your opportunity. And there's nothing that says people shouldn't be allowed to do that. But we do want to make sure that it's being done in a way where it is very difficult or not, if not impossible, for unscrupulous people to defraud others when it comes to cryptocurrencies. So various countries around the world are looking at how do we put the right controls and laws in place so that we can utilize cryptocurrencies effectively, but also fairly and safely. Now, having said all of that about cryptocurrencies are just the tip of the iceberg of potential applications of blockchain technology. Because pretty quickly after Bitcoin emerged in the early 2010s, people looking at that underlying technology said, you know, the real key to what blockchain is doing here is it's providing a shared uh, version of the truth to multiple people. And there's a lot of problems we have in business and society uh, that this underlying technology um, could help us to solve that have nothing to do with cryptocurrencies facilitating financial transactions. Let me give you a couple of examples. One is in supply chain management for manufacturers, distributors, retailers, and so forth. And the other example is in the news. So let's take the first example. One of the problems in supply chain management that has been there ever since there have been supply chains, which date back at the very least to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the early 19th century, and realistically, even before that, you had manufacturers, and manufacturers bought parts from other manufacturers, and those people bought materials from, you know, either manufacturers or people who were mining, say, materials, and so forth. And so there was multiple tiers by the time you started with the extractive industries, went through various levels of manufacturing and distribution and retailing, and they finally would get into the hands of end user individuals or organizations. And the problem is you never knew, it would be very difficult to know whether your manufacturer, who's your immediate supplier, is going to suddenly not be able to fulfill their orders because some parts and materials that they were depending on are not being fulfilled by their suppliers, because those suppliers in turn are having their operations disrupted by problems, whether it's meteorological problems or whether it's uh, uh, geopolitical problems and so forth, further up the supply chain. So people were constantly having to make decisions about what they could order, what they could make, what they could sell based on incomplete or inaccurate information. With blockchain technology, all of the relevant players in a supply chain can share information across a blockchain so that everybody can see all of the relevant information that they should be authorized to see. So if you're a buyer, for example, you don't want two different competitive suppliers to see the prices that their competitors are charging. But you do want to be sure that they are both seeing exactly the same information that you are providing in terms of here's what is our anticipated set of needs over the next X number of days, weeks, or months, so that they can provide you valid quotes. And that if you accept those quotes, you can confirm the information and you can agree on this electronically, and you can use something called a smart contract, which is basically the same thing as a written contract, only it's now done digitally. And with blockchain technology, it can't be arbitrarily changed by either participant in the contract. So you are all seeing the same information up and down the supply chain, and that can facilitate the flow of information. It can take cost out of supply chains, which can lower costs for manufacturers, for distributors, for retailers, and for individuals or organizations that are using these products. So there's a great potential for blockchain to enhance supply chain management, for example. Secondly, you can have the example of Internet of Things technologies that we talked about, with the truck driver turning off the air conditioning in their truck for most of the drive. Well, if their truck is capturing that data, and if they're part of a larger, more sophisticated system that again is unscrupulous organization, let's say, then what's to prevent them from capturing the data in the truck of the temperature and then changing the report on that data to report invalid information instead of the actual information showing that the temperature was allowed to rise to an unacceptable level while the meat, say, was being transported. Well, now if that Internet of Things technology sensor data is loaded onto a blockchain immediately, then you don't have one entity or one organization or person that can arbitrarily change it without everybody being aware that, wait a minute, they've gone in there and they've made a change to this data. There's something wrong. We need to investigate this. There's a problem here. Um, and blockchain technology can facilitate that. And so I like to think of blockchain and Internet of Things and AI as three legs of a stool that can enable fully digital valid transactions, where Internet of Things technology is capturing data from the real world of all kinds that we need to know. And it is then validated and verified by blockchain technology to make sure that it has not been arbitrarily changed by a particular entity that's involved in this process. And then AI to continuously monitor this huge flood of data that we couldn't possibly afford to hire enough people to continuously monitor themselves and make recommendations as to how best to be able to act on that data. And this is going to completely change and make much more cost effective the distribution of physical products and just a host of other applications across both the private and public sectors. Now, a second application that I referenced earlier briefly is news. And we have seen the very negative impacts of misinformation and disinformation, especially in political systems around the world, and especially in countries like Russia and others, where we have authoritarian leaders in place who are determined to stay in control regardless of the desires of their populace. They can manipulate and change data information to make it look like things are true that really are not true. And with AI, it's easy, relatively and quickly becoming relatively easier to create videos and audios that make it look like things are happening that aren't really happening. Well, it turns out, and again, I'm not going to get down into the technical details of how exactly this it can be done, but using blockchain technology, you could validate whether a video, for example, was actually recorded originally by sensors with that data stored on blockchain, which means a sensor, which is basically a video camera capturing images and sound, is actually showing what a real person said and did, or whether this was something that was created by an AI to make it look as though somebody said and did it. And by capturing that data immediately on blockchain, you can validate that, no, this was not created by AI or changed or edited by someone to make it look. I mean, for example, during the recent elections in the United States, one of the things that was happening is that comments made by political candidates were being taken, and even though AI wasn't being used to create this from the beginning, they were being edited out of context with keywords and phrases removed, and then those strung together to make it appear that these candidates were saying things that they never actually said. I mean, they did speak those words, but they didn't speak them in the order that was presented, but it made it look like they were doing that kind of thing. Well, with blockchain technology, you could validate from the time this information is created, who created it, how it was created, and if it is legitimate source of valid information. And that minimizes the possibility of disinformation and drastically reduces the possibility of misinformation. The distinction being, disinformation is when somebody intentionally puts incorrect or invalid information out there with the intention of misleading. Misinformation is when people share information that somebody put out there thinking it's correct, even though it's not. And that inadvertently ends up getting disseminated, and people think that something has happened that has happened. It may not have been created with the intent to deceive, but the end result is that people are unintentionally deceived. But blockchain technology can drastically reduce that likelihood and can come close to eliminating the possibility of intentional disinformation being disseminated around the internet. Now, again, it's going to take a long time to put all of these tools and technologies in place, but as they become stronger and better, there's a tremendous amount of potential value for blockchain technology. And again, to reiterate my opening point on the topic, this is entirely outside of and above and beyond the utilization of blockchain technology to enable cryptocurrencies for financial transactions. Now, the metaverse ties into these concepts that I mentioned briefly of extended reality, sometimes called art, augmented reality or virtual reality. So let's clarify what those terms mean. Uh, Virtual reality is when you put on a headset and you are seeing images and hearing sounds in many cases that are not actually present there in the real world, at least not present immediately in front of you. Now, it could be that you are communicating with somebody at a great distance, but through virtual reality, it looks to you and perhaps them, if they're doing the same thing, like you're sitting in the same room with each other. So it's not that virtual reality is always conveying something that's non-existent or not truthful, but it also can be used, for example, as we're seeing for things like game playing and role playing games, those kinds of things that a lot of people enjoy doing and making those seem much more realistic. Augmented reality is when, again, whether you're using glasses, and we're going to see these very quickly moving from these giant goggles that prevent you from seeing the outside world, things like more traditional looking eyeglasses, but that overlay information on the actual outside world that you're experiencing. And it could be anything from, as you're walking down the street, if you are looking for, say, a clothing shop, having something pop up in your field of vision, but via your glasses that point out to you on the next block on the left, there's a clothing shop of the type that you are looking for, to even more sophisticated forms that, and these are things we'll see in the future, and it may take 10, 15, 20 years before this kind of technology has reached this level of maturity. But where you could say, if you were in a historic environment, walking down the street and having all of the buildings and locations that you're walking past appear that they would have appeared 500 years ago, or even 1,000 years ago, or maybe even the people that are walking down the street that you're passing by in the street appear to be attired in the clothing styles that they might have worn 100 years ago or 500 years ago, or what have you, which, as you can imagine, would have tremendous potential for both education for people that are trying to learn about history, or just of general interest for people who want to experience that history. But these tools can also be used for very practical business-like applications. For instance, some of the applications I've seen virtual reality or augmented reality more frequently used for is training people to do such things as how to maintain a particular product. Let me tell you a story that I often use in some of my presentations when it's appropriate. So we have a part that needs to be installed on an airplane, and it's a new fuel injector that needs to be installed in one of the engines of the airplane. And we have a maintenance engineer who is familiar with installing fuel injectors. And as it happens, she is the only person available to install this fuel injector while this airplane is parked at the gate getting ready to leave within the next hour. And while she's very familiar with the general process, she hasn't happened to have installed this particular type of fuel injector on this particular engine in this airplane. But fortunately, the fuel injector comes with digital instructions. So she puts on her augmented reality goggles, and what happens is the instructions as to exactly what she needs to do step by step to install this fuel injector are projected onto the engine and walk her step by step. First, remove this cover, then loosen this part, and actually projecting visual images of what she needs to do next to install this. And because she is a knowledgeable and trained um, uh, aircraft maintenance engineer, even though she hasn't worked with this particular injector before, she's able to properly install it and get it done on a timely basis. And the end result is that the new fuel injector goes into place and the aircraft can take off on time and safely with the new fuel injector in place. And we don't have any costly to both the airline and the passengers delays while we wait around for somebody who already has personal experience with installing this particular type of fuel injector on this particular type of engine. Training people also can be done very well. The city of Austin, Texas, for example, uses virtual reality. They have a vehicle called an AMBUS, which is short for ambulance bus. And how it's different from a regular ambulance is a typical ambulance, which is the size of what we in the United States call an SUV or used to call a station wagon, will have, or a van, will have maybe two beds in it that people who need some kind of emergency medical treatment could be treated on while they're en route, say, to a hospital. An AM bus is designed to respond to potential larger scale disasters and will have up to a dozen beds on it. But they only have one of these ambuses, and they can't afford to take the ambus itself out of service to train the dozens and dozens of emergency medical personnel that would need to operate work on this ambus. So how do we get these people trained? So if they do need to be assigned, because if there is, some kind of large scale disaster, they're the ones that are available to work on it. Well, they developed a virtual reality training process where these people can put on virtual reality goggles and then walk through a room that is safe and of the right size and space, but it looks to them like they're actually in the ambus. They can open and close doors and drawers. They can see where various different supplies are located, where the different parts of where the different beds will be, where they would find bandages or medications of various types or what have you that they might need to use, so that if and when they're assigned to the ambus, even if it's the first time they've ever set foot on it and they have to help respond, they're already familiar with the layout, how it works, where everything is. And so that's an excellent example of using extended reality technology to train people. Now, what the metaverse concept is about is making that much broader, allowing for multiple people in multiple locations around the world to have a sense of shared space or shared reality. And the challenge to doing that well is it's going to require massive amounts of computing power, massive amounts of communications bandwidth, so that as things change in real time, people are interacting with one another or with the internal systems, whether it's a bunch of people playing a multiplayer role-playing game of some kind, or whether it's a bunch of people coordinating on the development and implementation of some kind of change to the real world that requires people in multiple times and places to be able to respond in a coordinated way. So metaverse technology, where your interface with what people call the metaverse, which could be a representation of the real world or it can be a representation of an imaginary world, is mitigated through visual, audio, and eventually even um, uh, finger sensitive, what they call haptic technologies, which makes your body be able to feel things like grasping an object or feeling wind blowing and that sort of thing. Um, that's going to become more and more powerful and effective over time. I personally think it's going to be 10, 15, 20 years as this technology emerges. Um, but the massive increases that we're seeing in computing power and communications bandwidth that are being brought about to facilitate artificial intelligence, among other things, are also going to have other beneficial effects um, going forward in terms of enabling the utilization of tools like extended reality, such as reflected in the metaverse, um, blockchain technologies, Internet of Things technologies. The end result is, I am absolutely convinced that we're going to see more changes in the next 10 to 15 years in our world, in our lives, um, than we have seen in hundreds, perhaps even thousands of years.